Ethan Carter had always believed in structure and order. It came with the territory of being a postal worker, precision, efficiency, and an unwavering respect for the rules. After years of dedicated service, he finally purchased a cozy suburban home in a quiet, well-maintained neighborhood. It was nothing extravagant, but it was his, a place where he could unwind after long shifts and enjoy the simple pleasures of life, like a cold drink on his porch after a hot summer day. His home was his sanctuary. The Mailbox, a sturdy, regulation-approved unit, stood proudly by the curb, a necessity for a man whose livelihood revolved around delivering letters and packages. It was a mailbox like any other, except for a subtle, well-kept decal of the USPS logo, his little badge of honor, a silent nod to the job he took pride in. And that's where Karen came in. Karen Whitmore wasn't just any neighbor. She was the self-proclaimed queen of the Homeowners Association, ruling over the community with an iron fist wrapped in passive-aggressive smiles. With her clipboard clutched like a scepter, she monitored everything, from the shade of garden mulch to the exact wattage of porch lights. And now, she had her sights set on Ethan. It started with a knock on his door one afternoon. He wiped his hands on his postal uniform, fresh from a long shift, and answered. There stood Karen, her short blonde bob stiff with hairspray, a smug tilt to her lips. In her hands, a neatly typed letter, already folded into a crisp envelope. "Mr. Carter," she said in that sugary sweet yet condescending tone. "I'm here on behalf of the HOA. We have a small issue with your mailbox." Ethan raised a brow. "My mailbox?" "Yes." She handed him the letter, watching him closely as he unfolded it. According to the HOA guidelines, all mailboxes must conform to the community's aesthetic. Yours, unfortunately, does not. He scanned the paper. Violation. Non-conforming mailbox design. Fine. $250. Ethan let out a slow breath. "Karen, this is a standard USPS-approved mailbox. It meets federal regulations." "Oh, I don't doubt that," she chirped. "But our neighborhood has certain visual standards, and that decal, well, it simply doesn't align with the uniformity we strive for." He fought the urge to laugh. "You're fining me over a sticker?" "It's a violation," she said, shrugging. "Nothing personal, of course." Ethan folded the letter and tucked it in his pocket. "You know I work for the Postal Service, right? You're literally fining me for something that falls under federal jurisdiction." Karen's expression didn't waver. "The HOA rules are very clear. You have until the end of the week to remove the decal or pay the fine." Ethan shook his head, a smirk tugging at his lips. "I'm not removing it." Her eyes narrowed, her smile thinning. "Then I suppose you'll have to deal with the consequences." With that, she turned on her heel and strutted back down his driveway, leaving Ethan standing there, shaking his head. A $250 fine for a mailbox sticker? He had dealt with irate customers, impossible delivery schedules, and snowstorms in the dead of winter. But this was the most ridiculous thing he'd ever encountered. Karen had no idea who she was messing with, and she was about to find out. Ethan had seen his fair share of absurdity in life, but this? A $250 fine for a mailbox decal? He figured it was a minor annoyance, something Karen could huff and puff about before moving on to her next petty crusade. He was wrong. The very next morning, as he grabbed his coffee and stepped outside to start his day, he spotted something taped to his front door. Another notice. He tore it off and read the bolded text. "Final warning. Failure to comply will result in escalating fines and legal action. Amount due, $750. Ethan let out a low chuckle. "So, that's how we're playing this." As if on cue, Karen appeared from down the sidewalk, hands clasped in front of her like she was on a royal inspection. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she called out with mock cheerfulness. "I see you've received the notice." Ethan folded the paper neatly, tucking it into his pocket. "I did. And I'll tell you what I told you yesterday. I'm not removing my decal." Karen's smile didn't falter. "Well, that's unfortunate. The HOA rules apply to everyone." Ethan crossed his arms. "I don't recall signing any agreement when I moved in." She waved a dismissive hand. Oh, the HOA was formed after you moved in. But don't worry, all homeowners were automatically enrolled. So, I never actually agreed to anything? Well, technically no. But majority rules, Mr. Carter. It's a democracy. He took a slow sip of his coffee. Funny, I thought democracy involved choice. Karen's eye twitched, but she recovered quickly. You'll find that resisting the HOA isn't in your best interest. Just pay the fine, Ethan. It's only going to get worse if you don't. He shook his head. Not happening. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Have it your way. She turned on her heel, storming off as if she had already won. Ethan knew better. Karen escalates the battle. Later that day, Ethan went down to the city zoning office. He knew a thing or two about regulations, and HOA overreach was a hot topic in his line of work. He filed a formal complaint, citing the absurdity of the fine and requesting a legal review of the HOA's authority over his property. Unfortunately, the moment he took a stand, things took a turn for the worse. By the end of the week, city inspectors started showing up at his house, first for a sudden anonymous noise complaint, then for an alleged zoning violation on his garage, and then for a supposed issue with the height of his fence. Each time, Ethan provided documentation proving he was within code. And each time, the inspectors left looking a little annoyed that they had been called out for nothing. It wasn't hard to figure out who was behind it. One afternoon, as Ethan was returning from work, he saw Karen standing with two other HOA board members at the end of his driveway. One of them, a middle-aged man with glasses, looked visibly uncomfortable. Karen, however, was in her element. Mr. Carter, I hope you're ready to cooperate, she said sweetly. Ethan leaned against his mailbox, crossing his arms. Oh, I'm always ready. What's the problem this time? She smiled. We've had multiple complaints about your property. He raised a brow. Complaints from whom? Karen waved a hand. That's confidential, of course. But as a courtesy, the HOA has decided to give you one last opportunity to pay the fine before we escalate further. Ethan exhaled through his nose. He wasn't a man who liked confrontation, but he also wasn't a pushover. You know what, Karen, he said, stepping forward. I did a little research of my own, and it turns out the HOA doesn't have the legal authority to enforce fines on a property that wasn't part of the original HOA agreement. Meaning, you can't actually do a damn thing to me. Karen's smug expression flickered. The man beside her, the one who looked uncomfortable, cleared his throat. Actually, Karen, he's not wrong. I looked into it too, and... She shot him a glare so sharp it could cut steel. Ethan smirked. Something wrong. Karen recovered, flashing another tight smile. Oh, we'll see about that. She turned on her heel and walked off, leaving Ethan standing there, watching her go. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Ethan had dealt with difficult people before. He'd navigated tight delivery schedules, unruly customers, and unpredictable weather. But Karen? She was on another level. She wasn't just enforcing petty rules. She was orchestrating a campaign against him. And she was getting desperate. The false violations start rolling in. The next morning, Ethan woke up to find 3 new violation notices taped to his front door. Failure to maintain lawn appearance, a $300 fine. Improper trash can storage, a $500 fine. Mailbox noncompliance, final warning, now raised to $1,200. Ethan ran a hand down his face. His lawn was perfectly trimmed, his trash bins were where they'd always been, and, well, the mailbox was still federal property. This was pure retaliation. As he read over the ridiculous notices, a familiar voice chimed in. Good morning, Mr. Carter. Ethan turned to see Karen, standing at the end of his driveway like a villain in a made-for-TV drama. She held a clipboard, smiling like she hadn't just fabricated multiple violations out of thin air. Enjoying your morning mail? She asked smugly. Ethan exhaled through his nose, folding the notices. Karen, these fines are illegal. You can't just make up rules and expect me to pay. She shrugged. The HOA board has reviewed your case and deemed you non-compliant. You have until the end of the month to pay, or will be forced to take further action. Ethan narrowed his eyes. Further action? Karen's smile widened. Eviction proceedings. He barked out a laugh. You think you can evict me from my own home? That's not how this works. Oh, it absolutely is, she said, pulling out a stack of HOA documents. Per Section 7C of the Community Guidelines, the HOA can place a lien on your property for unpaid fines. If those fines accumulate, foreclosure proceedings can begin. She tapped the papers with her perfectly manicured nails. You might want to start packing. Ethan's jaw tightened. He knew HOAs could be a nightmare, but this was next-level corruption. And if Karen thought he was just going to roll over, she was in for a rude awakening. Digging into the HOA's dirty secrets. Ethan wasn't the only one tired of Karen's antics. Over the next few days, he started talking to neighbors, off the record. He asked casual questions, just enough to get people talking. What he found? Karen had a pattern. Several homeowners had mysterious fines disappear after they made donations to the HOA's discretionary fund. Some had been threatened just like him, only to have their cases resolved when they hired Karen's recommended lawyer. One neighbor whispered that Karen had been using HOA funds for personal expenses, fancy dinners, shopping sprees, even a weekend spa retreat she claimed was for board member development. Ethan took careful notes. He also installed cameras. If Karen wanted to play dirty, he'd document every move. The final piece fell into place when a nervous-looking HOA board member, David, approached him one evening. Listen, David muttered, glancing over his shoulder. I can't say much, but Karen's not following protocol. She's making up rules. The HOA doesn't even have legal authority over certain properties, including yours. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Then why hasn't anyone stopped her? David sighed. She bullies the board into compliance. If we push back, she threatens us. Ethan crossed his arms. Threatens you with what? David hesitated. Then, with a glance at Ethan's security cameras, he whispered, she spies on people. Gets dirt on them. Uses it to keep everyone in line. Ethan's expression darkened. Karen wasn't just abusing her position, she was weaponizing it. But she'd just made one fatal mistake. She'd messed with the wrong homeowner. Setting the trap. Ethan gathered proof. Every fake violation. Every absurd fine. Every shady piece of HOA financial paperwork he could get his hands on. Then he made a few phone calls. One was to his friend in the city's zoning office. The other? A lawyer specializing in HOA abuse cases. It was time to turn the tables. And if Karen thought she was untouchable, she was about to get the shock of her life. Ethan was a patient man. His job required it. Dealing with impossible delivery schedules, irate customers, and the occasional stray dog eager to chomp on a mailbag. But patience had its limits. And Karen had just crossed the line. He had gathered his evidence, spoken to the right people, and now, it was his turn to make a move. Karen's most outrageous stunt yet. Ethan had started expecting the ridiculous. Every morning, he braced himself for a new bogus fine or another phony complaint. But even he wasn't prepared for what happened next. He woke up to the sound of machinery outside his house. Still groggy, he grabbed his phone and stepped out onto the porch. What he saw made his blood boil. A construction crew, hired by the HOA, was digging up his driveway. Karen stood nearby, arms crossed, watching like a queen overseeing her empire. Ethan stormed down the steps. What the hell is this? A worker barely spared him a glance. Sidewalk expansion project. HOA orders. Ethan's hands clenched into fists. Sidewalk expansion? On his private property? Karen smirked. Oh, Mr. Carter, didn't you read the updated HOA guidelines? We're improving the community, and your driveway is in the way. Ethan took a slow breath. He'd been waiting for this moment. Let me guess, he said, crossing his arms. You never got a city permit for this, did you? Karen's smirk faltered. Excuse me? Ethan pulled out his phone, scrolling through emails. I spoke with zoning officials last week. Any modification to private property requires city approval. No such permit exists for this. Karen's face paled. Ethan turned to the workers. Pack it up, guys. This project is illegal. The foreman, an older guy who clearly had no patience for HOA nonsense, sighed and waved his team to stop. Karen's composure cracked. "You can't do this," she snapped. "This is community property." Ethan let out a mock gasp. "Oh, you mean the property that—" He flipped through his emails, stopping on one and turning the phone toward her. "The city legally recognizes as mine?" Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish. The foreman didn't wait for an explanation. "We're outta here," he said, motioning to his crew. Within minutes, the workers packed up, leaving behind a half-dug trench in Ethan's driveway. Ethan turned back to Karen. "You just trespassed and authorized destruction of private property without a permit." His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "Hope you have a good lawyer." Karen's face turned red. She pointed a shaking finger at him. "This isn't over." "Oh, I know," Ethan said, tucking his phone away. "See you at the HOA meeting." The HOA meeting from hell. Ethan walked into the next HOA meeting with a thick folder of evidence. The community center was packed, homeowners whispering among themselves, clearly fed up with Karen's reign of terror. Karen sat at the front, still smug despite what had happened. She wasn't backing down. That was fine. Neither was Ethan. The meeting started, and Karen wasted no time. "Before we begin, I'd like to address an ongoing issue: certain homeowners refusing to follow community standards." Ethan leaned back, arms crossed. "That's funny, Karen. I was just about to say the same thing." Karen glared. "This is an HOA meeting, Mr. Carter. You are expected to." Ethan stood, holding up printed emails from the city zoning office. "Let's start with the illegal driveway project you approved, on property that you don't own." Murmurs rippled through the room. Ethan tossed another document onto the table. "And then there's the fake fines. The bogus violations. The complaints that conveniently disappear when people donate to the HOA fund." The murmurs grew louder. Karen gritted her teeth. "This is absurd. You have no proof." Ethan reached into his folder and pulled out security footage stills, screenshots from his cameras showing Karen sneaking around his property at night, taping violations to his door at 2 a.m. The room went dead silent. One of the board members, David, the one who had warned Ethan, stood up. "Karen," he said, voice shaking. "Is this true?" Karen looked trapped. I was just ensuring compliance." Another board member spoke up. "You've been using HOA funds for personal expenses, haven't you?" Karen's face turned ashen. Ethan let the silence hang for a moment before delivering the final blow. "I filed a formal complaint with the city," he said, placing a final document on the table. "And they're launching an official investigation into the HOA's finances." Gasps erupted. Karen shot to her feet. "This meeting is over." She grabbed her purse and stormed out. But this time, no one followed her. The tide begins to turn. As Karen fled, homeowners began talking loudly. "She tried to find me for a garden gnome last year. I always knew something was shady about those donations. Can we remove her?" David, still shaken, turned to Ethan. "What now?" Ethan smiled. "Now? We take back our neighborhood." Karen had lost control. For the first time in years, she wasn't in charge. The neighborhood had turned against her. The HOA board was questioning her leadership, and an official city investigation was looming over her like a dark cloud. But Karen wasn't the type to go down without a fight. No, she had one last desperate move to play: calling the police, and it backfires. 2 days after the disastrous HOA meeting, Ethan was enjoying a rare, peaceful evening. He was on his porch, sipping coffee, watching the sunset when flashing red and blue lights lit up his street. A police cruiser pulled into his driveway. Ethan frowned, setting down his cup as 2 officers stepped out. "Evening, officers," he greeted, calm as ever. "Something I can help you with?" One officer, a stocky man with a weary expression, glanced at his notepad. "We got a report about a public disturbance. Something about excessive light pollution." Ethan blinked. "Light pollution?" The officer sighed. "Yeah. The complainant claims your porch lights are violating some community standard and causing a neighborhood hazard." Ethan couldn't help it, he laughed. Let me guess, he said, crossing his arms. The complaint came from a Karen Whitmore? The officer exchanged a knowing look with his partner. How'd you know? Ethan shook his head. Because this is the 5th time she's tried to find me over a mailbox. Now that she's lost, she's resorting to wasting your time. The officers were already over it. Sir, your lights are clearly within legal limits, the officer said. This isn't a police matter. Seems like someone's abusing emergency services to settle a personal grudge. Ethan smirked. Oh, trust me. That's exactly what's happening. One officer turned toward Karen's house, shaking his head. We'll have a word with her. Ethan chuckled. Tell her I said hi. Karen crosses the line, and it ends her. That police stunt? It wasn't Karen's last move. She was desperate, grasping at anything to regain her power. So, she did something illegal. She hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on Ethan. Ethan only found out when his security cameras caught a stranger sneaking around his garage at 3 a.m. When he checked the footage, it was clear. The man was trying to access his mailbox, a federal offense. Ethan smiled. She'd finally gone too far. The next morning, he took the footage straight to the police station. Someone hired this guy to snoop on my property, Ethan told the officer at the front desk, sliding over a flash drive. And if I had to guess, I'd say it was Karen Whitmore. The officer inserted the drive, watching the footage. His eyebrows shot up. This is breaking and entering. And tampering with my mailbox is a federal crime, Ethan added. So, I'd say it's time someone paid a visit to Karen. The officer nodded. We'll take it from here. Karen's public humiliation. That evening, Ethan was enjoying another peaceful porch moment when police cruisers pulled up to Karen's house. Lights flashed. Officers knocked. The neighborhood came outside to watch. Karen argued. She flailed her arms, tried to play the victim, but the police weren't having it. When they pulled out their notebook, reading her the charges, the neighborhood erupted in whispers. She actually did that. She's insane. I knew she was bad, but this? Ethan sat back in his chair, sipping his coffee. And then came the moment he'd been waiting for. A police officer looked Karen dead in the eye and said, "Ma'am, you're under investigation for trespassing, harassment, and potential mail tampering. You need to come with us." Karen's face drained of color. No, no, no. You can't do this, she screeched. I'm the head of the HOA. The officer sighed. Not anymore, you're not. The entire neighborhood watched as Karen was escorted into the back of the police car. Someone actually started clapping. Ethan just leaned back and smiled. Karen had dug her own grave. And this time, there was no escaping the consequences. Karen's dramatic arrest sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. For years, she had ruled with an iron clipboard, threatening, fining, and intimidating homeowners into submission. But now, the queen had fallen. The next morning, the neighborhood group chat exploded with messages. Did you see Karen getting hauled off last night? Finally. I thought we'd never be free of her. Does this mean we can paint our doors whatever color we want now? Ethan read the messages with a smirk as he sipped his morning coffee. The rebellion had begun. The HOA board turns on Karen. With Karen out of the picture, the remaining HOA board members scrambled to save face. At an emergency meeting, David, the board member who had secretly helped Ethan, stepped up to the podium. He cleared his throat. Effective immediately, Karen Whitmore has been removed from the HOA board. A wave of cheers erupted. David continued, glancing nervously at the angry homeowners. And, given the recent investigation into our finances, the HOA will be under city review. Another murmur rippled through the crowd. Ethan stood up. And what about the fines? The bogus violations? Are those getting erased? David gulped. Why yes. Effective immediately, all outstanding HOA fines will be voided. More cheers. A woman raised her hand. And what about the mandatory donations Karen was collecting? David hesitated. Ethan stepped forward, laying down a thick file of printed bank statements. I went through HOA financials, he said. And it turns out Karen was using HOA funds for her own personal expenses. The room erupted in outrage. David sighed. "We'll be issuing refunds where possible. And the HOA will be dissolved by next month." That was the moment the neighborhood cheered the loudest. For the first time in years, they were free. And Karen? She had lost everything. Karen's swift fall from power. Within 48 hours, Karen's house was listed for sale. The woman who had once dictated every aspect of the community was now fleeing it. Her perfectly manicured lawn? Overgrown. Her usual morning walks of inspection? Gone. Her obnoxious, passive-aggressive emails? Silenced. One morning, Ethan stepped outside to grab his mail when he noticed a moving truck in Karen's driveway. Karen stood beside it, barking orders at the movers, a shell of her former self. Ethan took a long sip of his coffee, making zero effort to hide his smirk. As she turned, their eyes met. For the first time ever, she had nothing to say. Ethan gave her a polite nod. "Safe travels, Karen." Her jaw clenched, but she said nothing. And just like that, Karen Whitmore disappeared from the neighborhood for good. Karen's downfall wasn't just a victory for the neighborhood. It was the beginning of the end for the HOA itself. With the city investigation in full swing, inspectors combed through years of financial records. What they found? A gold mine of corruption. The HOA faces the heat. Ethan had been waiting for this moment. A week after Karen's exit, he received a call from the city's legal department. "Mr. Carter," the official said, "you'll be pleased to know that the HOA has been fined $50,000 for illegal enforcement of non-existent rules." Ethan grinned. Music to my ears. "That's not all," the official continued. "Several board members are facing civil lawsuits, and Karen? Well, let's just say she won't be meddling in community affairs anytime soon." Ethan leaned back in his chair, fully enjoying the moment. "What about the homeowners who got scammed by Karen's fake fines?" he asked. "We're working on that," the official assured him. "All illegitimate charges will be refunded." A refund was nice, but Ethan had one more card to play. Ethan's final power move. The HOA board members, what was left of them, were desperate to avoid lawsuits. David, looking more stressed than ever, called an emergency homeowners vote. The topic? Dissolving the HOA entirely. Ethan showed up, arms crossed, watching as David addressed the crowd. "I think we can all agree," David said, clearing his throat, "that under Karen's leadership, mistakes were made." Someone from the crowd shouted, "Mistakes?" "She threatened to foreclose on people's homes." David winced. "Yes, well, given the circumstances, I propose we dissolve the HOA completely." Silence. Then Ethan stood up. "I second that motion." More voices chimed in. "About time. Let's do it. Burn it to the ground." The vote. Unanimous. The HOA was dead. The final nail in the coffin. With the HOA gone, the neighborhood took back control. New rules were set by actual homeowners, not power-hungry dictators. The ridiculous fines and restrictions? Gone. And Karen's legacy of fear and control? Completely erased. Ethan took one last stroll through the neighborhood, watching families repaint their houses, people setting up yard decorations without fear, and kids riding bikes on the sidewalk without being scolded. For the first time in years, the community felt like home again. And Karen? She wasn't coming back. Karen had always believed she was untouchable. For years, she lorded over the neighborhood, using fear, intimidation, and bogus fines to get her way. But now, she was gone. And things were only getting worse for her. Karen hits rock bottom. Word traveled fast. The HOA was dissolved, the lawsuits were stacking up, and Karen had lost everything. Her house? Sold at a loss. Her reputation? Destroyed. Her cushy life? Over. But Ethan wasn't done yet. One afternoon, he got a call from a former HOA board member. "You won't believe this," the man chuckled. "I just found out where Karen ended up." Ethan leaned forward, intrigued. "Where?" "You're gonna love this," the man said. "She got a job as an assistant property manager for another HOA." Ethan burst out laughing. It was too perfect. One last encounter. A few weeks later, Ethan had to visit a nearby town for work. While grabbing coffee at a small cafe, he saw her.
Karen.
She was wearing a cheap office blazer, her once pristine hair now looking less polished, and she was arguing with a customer over a $25 late fee. Ethan couldn't resist. He walked over, leaned in, and said just loud enough for her to hear, "I hope you like following the rules." Karen whipped around, her face draining of color as she recognized him. Ethan just smiled, tipped his coffee toward her, and walked out. Poetic justice. With Karen gone, and the HOA officially dissolved, the neighborhood transformed. Gone were the ridiculous fines, the petty rules, and the constant fear of breaking some imaginary regulation. Now, families painted their doors whatever color they wanted. Lawn decorations came back in full force. Someone even put up a flamingo mailbox, just out of spite. And Ethan? He finally got to enjoy his home in peace. A moment of humor. One evening, Ethan was sitting on his porch, sipping his coffee, when a neighbor approached with a piece of paper in hand. "Hey, Ethan," the man said with a grin. "Since you took down the HOA, we thought you might want to see this." Ethan took the paper, raising an eyebrow. It was a mock violation notice. Infraction. Owning a mailbox too awesome for this neighborhood. Fine. 1 free drink at the next barbecue. Ethan burst out laughing. He shook his head, crumpling the fake ticket. They really tried. The neighbor clapped him on the back. "Come on, hero. Burgers are on the grill." As he walked toward the gathering, Ethan glanced at his perfectly legal mailbox, a satisfied smile on his face. Karen had tried everything. And in the end, she'd lost.